Welcome to another executive interview for Becoming Retail. This is a content series that looks into the hearts and minds of retail leaders during digital transformation. I am super excited to have Alicia Erdman here with me today. She's the VP of Strategy and Analytics at ARIA International. We met a few years ago at a conference. She's been a dear mentor for me for the past few years. She is brilliant, and I am beyond excited to be able to share her insights into retail, digital transformation, and leadership here today. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here, Michelle. It's good to see you.
Awesome. So let's get started and take a trip down memory lane and talk about your retail career. Before you became an integral part of the industry, you were actually a principal at Boston Consulting Group. So what made you change your mind and kind of jump right into the industry?
Yeah, it's a good question because I certainly didn't go into consulting with an expectation of retail as my end game. I partly went into consulting because I didn't know what industry would be the end game. And certainly one of the propositions of a consulting firm like BCG is exposure. I think quickly what came to mind for me for both retail as well as consumer goods was there's a tangibility to it. We're all consumers at the end of the day. And that made that move easier at first. I've also been always attracted to, or at least through that experience, attracted to brands. And so if you look at my retail history, it's not any retail, it's very much branded retail. And for me, the brands themselves can be bigger than the business, and they can stand for something that I can connect to. And so in each of the brands that I've been a part of, there's something core in that brand that allows me to connect. I think, I will add also, though, what has kept me, maybe in addition to what interested me in the first place. And honestly, it's the complexity. Retail is not easy. And I think that's what makes it fun. But it is complicated. It takes work. It really takes some good hard thinking and structure at every moment.
And your first role was at the Gap, where you were the VP of let me get this right, the VP of Corporate Operating Strategy. And while there, you had a front row seat to the Athleta acquisition, which has paid off handsomely for the company. What did you learn, or what did you see from your view as part of the strategy group when they acquired Athleta?
Yeah, so the role included what sometimes is called corporate development. And so myself and my team, we were responsible for the evaluation of acquisition opportunities. And Athleta, it just was easy. We had done a lot of work in prior years looking at what adjacent markets would be interesting to the company. And the athletic space was a space that Gap didn't have any business being in at that time, and had no presence in, and had no authenticity in. And Athleta had that authenticity. It was small, but it was an incredibly strong brand with a base of very loyal consumers without a lot of awareness. And so the 1 + 1 = 5 was such simple math for us. We could bring exposure to a very strong brand in an adjacent space. And the icing on the cake was we could add stores. They had no stores at the time. They were a catalog business at birth, so to speak, became an online business, and did not have that expertise. So a lot of the work in corporate development is honestly looking at the strengths on both sides and making sure that those aren't necessarily redundant or duplicative, but actually synergistic when you bring them together. And so Gap, having the exposure of millions and millions of online consumers, as well as the core retail bricks and mortar ability to roll out stores, it was an easy equation, and a lot of upside for everybody.
Mm-hmm. And kind of that first step to like very omni-channel, right? Marrying that store base from Gap and the expertise with the catalog/online expertise from Athleta, which, I mean, they're still going to add stores, even though I think about 60% of their revenue is still online.
Right. It absolutely. I mean, it was a fascinating learning. The head of Gap's online business at the time was the business leader who took Athleta into his organization. And he, to be candid, was somewhat anti-stores. He was an online-centric individual, the founder of eToys. But we did the consumer research, and the athletic consumer wanted a door. She wanted to touch and feel the product before purchasing. And so from the get-go, the rollout, as you said, was omni-channel. It was the ability to ship from store from the start. It was the connectivity between what they see in a catalog or what they see online and what they experience in the store. So it really was, that model was a great way to begin an omni-channel journey for a brand.
Mhm. And from there, you went over to another powerful brand, Nike, where you're the VP of Global Strategy. And now we see, obviously, they pivoted to a direct consumer strategy. Did your team help at all craft that strategy?
Yes, we were actually heavily involved in much of the work, although I might reposition it a bit to call it a digital strategy.
Okay.
The notion of direct and the notion of stores had been around for obviously quite some time at Nike. That itself was a transition, and really it was before my time that they brought Gene Jackson, a notoriety in retail, off the board to run the Nike Direct business in 2009. And so the stores component was fairly well accepted, although certainly not the mindset. The real push when I was there was this digital first mentality. And that was the key. And it was led by the president of the brand at the time, not with knowing exactly where to go with it. And that was where my team was really involved, and myself was really involved, was digital matters. And we used to call it the three-headed monster. We just didn't quite know what was most important in the moment. And so we had digital brand, which obviously is the marketing component. We had .com, which was the business component. And then we had digital sport. And they were three separate entities and three separate strategies that we were in the moment trying to understand how they interconnected. And if one was, to be completely honest about it, more important than the other. And how could you be good at all of them at the same time? And so those were the questions we were really working with the leaders on, in addition to, I think, what has now become their foundation, which is this notion of membership. And so digital with membership, I think, has been the huge unlock for Nike right now in a direct conversation with the consumer.
Mhm. And when you kind of alluded to one of the problems, which was trying to figure out where you wanted to go, what the priorities were. How were there other obstacles in trying to implement a new digital first mindset in your experience?
Yeah, it's consistent, honestly, with some of the things we're talking about in my current company. Nike was and still remains a wholesale brand. The
Mhm.
operations, the executives, the experiences, the years behind everybody were to optimize for a wholesale model. So the notion of going direct, it creates concerns for folks. It's risks of cannibalization. It's a different P&L conversation. It's a different level of investment in different places. And really, I mean, you used the word, Michelle, it's a mindset shift that it doesn't happen overnight. It is not a light switch. And that notion of, we actually can connect to the consumers almost one-to-one. I don't really like the one-to-one mentality or terminology, but we can have a direct connection to the consumer versus an arm's length connection, which is candidly what wholesale often becomes. Really took a lot of, a mindset shift to say, what's the unlock when you do that? And I think that's been a journey Nike's been on, and they continue to unlock more and more. I mean, I just was looking at their latest earnings call, and I mean, it's phenomenal at what they've been able to do and drive in the last few years.
Mhm. And yeah, and from there, you went to become the VP Global Product and Merchandising Data and Analytics, which is a mouthful.
It
So
is.
I'd love to learn what that role entailed and why you decided to take that on.
Yeah, it is part of, in parallel to the digital journey, I think Nike is on an analytics journey, and there's overlap, and it's obviously a Venn diagram, but the space I was in was fairly independent of the digital side of things at the time. I'd had analytics in my background, and so while at Gap, I guess 2 years in, I'd had the added responsibility of a group of data scientists in an organization we called Operating Strategy. And so I knew what you could unlock with analytics in inventory and in pricing, and really bringing, that both the statistical side as well as the science side to bear for the business. And I had actually done as the head of strategy at Nike, I had done the work on what do we need to do to improve product and merchandising analytics. And so the move over was both easy because I had laid the foundation from a strategic perspective, and also somewhat easy because I had the vocabulary and the know-how to say, here, there's real unlock here. And if you can start being more predictive about consumer demand, more able to know what you need to have where, at what time in retail, there's an unlock. And whether it's through our wholesale partners at retail or through the direct business at retail for Nike, that notion of bringing science to the art was new, particularly in the product space. And so there was a lot of upside and opportunity there. But it did take strategy work as well to figure out, where do you place it? How do you build the capability in addition to delivering the value?
Yeah, so if we could dive in to the analytics piece a bit more, you're now again back in strategy and analytics. So that's your VP of strategy and analytics at Ariat. What do you see the role of analytics being? It sounds like at Nike was, what kind of, how much product will we need? Where will we need it? When will we need it? What other applications do you see analytics being used for, and what sort of divisions or groups within the organization should be using?
I kind of want to say everyone. I mean, strategy at its core starts with data. It starts with context, which is data. It starts with information, and you can't create strategy in the abstract. You can't just ask an open-ended question and come up with a good model without data on the table or facts on the table. Analytics becomes a spectrum that starts there. There's the simple facts on the table to the conclusions about root cause, what happened or why did something happen, to the level of predictability, what do we think is going to happen? And then you get into the true level of advanced analytics, and it's what should we do to get the results we want? Those kinds of questions are applicable whether it's in product development, whether it's in inventory management, whether honestly, and where my focus with Ariat right now is in the digital marketing side of things and building the online business. So really just trying to aid decision making. And some of it's ad hoc and some of it's one-time decision making, some of it's strategic direction. And then sometimes you unlock something that can be embedded in your operations. And so when I think about analytics, it's a little bit of that matrix of the level of complexity, from what happened down to what should we do to get the results we want, the prescriptive piece, across the dimensions of how is it going to be executed to impact the business. And those dimensions are a one-time view to change how we do things, to more of a sustained operating input, so to speak. At Gap, we call them smart starts, where you use analytics to say, hey, here's what analytics based on history should tell you in terms of your order quantity for the next season. It's a smart start. It was embedded in the inventory planning tools, and it gave planners a place to say, I believe it's going to be higher or lower based on their intuition and the fact that trends change and history is not a perfect predictor. So a lot.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's great. It's super fascinating. A follow-up question to that is, when you think about, obviously there's some questions that are ad hoc and you use the data and analytics on an ad hoc basis, but have you seen kind of the frequency of some of the data that's embedded operationally change? And at what pace are you kind of using it if it needs to be done on a regular cadence?
Yeah, it comes down to, honestly, the advancement within the field and what vendors and service providers can put at the table. When I was first touching and starting in analytics with a small group of 7 or 8 data scientists, we were building everything. the notion of markdown optimization was an ingrown formula, algorithms that we had to then partner with the technology team to embed into a planning system, which was homegrown. Now, and Salesforce provides some of this for sure. The tools are more well known, the algorithms are more established, and you don't need to build everything as a small or even as a large company. I see that honestly as one of my challenges with this new role, is to know, what can I buy? Why I don't need to recreate the wheel at this point in the journey of analytics across the industry. What can I take advantage of that other people have made more formulaic and embed? And then what do I want to build? And it honestly is as much building analytical processes, perhaps, as it is building, sustainable analytical tools at this point. And we think of that as marketing automation potential. We want to build a process by which we are consistently testing. And as we get stronger test results, we're automating our actions against those and then going to the next hypothesis to see if we can take it a step further.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about the process as much as the technology. Is that around like getting people to adopt the data and trust the data? Is there any sort of is that one element that you can expound upon?
Yes. In my time at Nike, I used to talk to my team about, and the analogy, it got a little stretched, but the notion of, we can stock the pond, but that doesn't mean people will fish. We can put fishing rods down by the pond. That still doesn't mean that they'll be there. We can stand nearby, ready to teach and train them. But at some point, we might just have to create, do the fish fry and welcome them all to the table, give them the taste that way. And so there's absolutely, there's a journey in adoption, I guess, is the way I've thought about it most recently. And that a critical component of an analytics strategy is making sure that you're pulling the thread of adoption, that you're finding the ready, willing, and able business partners, whether it's with ad hoc, whether it's with an operational solution, and you're starting with them and working with them to make sure that you're not just doing analytics for the sake of interesting, but that you're able to pull the thread to impact, and to pull that thread to impact, you've got to go through them, so to speak. And so as I'm thinking about it now with Area, smarter for my Nike experience for sure, mm-hmm. That notion of the analytical acumen of an organization, in addition to analytical capabilities of people within the analytics team. If your organization isn't step in stride with you, we're going to do a lot of interesting things that don't move the needle.
That's amazing. So brilliant. As we've talked about, you've spent actually most of your time at wholesale brands, and Ariat is another one. And nowadays, everyone has to have a direct to consumer element, particularly digital, because of the pandemic. What advice do you have for other brands who are kind of just starting out on this journey because they're forced to, digitally transform in order to connect with their consumer in a digital fashion due to the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the place I start with that one is to not think about it in isolation. It really is, and the word omnichannel is probably overused, but this notion of running two separate consumer journeys is outdated. But most organizations still run a division that's their direct to consumer and likely their online.com division, and then a wholesale division. And they're two separate offenses, and they often clash. The folks who are in the wholesale space, they've got great partners that they've had for years, and they don't want to run a risk of cannibalizing some of that business. And the folks that are in the digital space are trying to make sure they've got a unique and compelling value proposition to compete online. That the sports analogies, the phrasing at Nike was broad, but mm-hmm. One of my favorite terms that they talked about was this notion of an integrated offense. And so I think brands or businesses that are getting into the digital space have an advantage, honestly, to start thinking about it as one. It is a market that you're going after. You've got an arsenal that includes a digital channel and physical stores. Rather than look at, did my store grow? Did my online grow? You look at whether the market is growing, and you look for the opportunities that the strength of one becomes a blessing to the other. And it sounds a little trite even as I'm saying it to you, but it is that notion of the consumer isn't differentiating. The consumer is going to shop. Their journey, this learn, this choose, this buy, this return, hopefully not. It's fluid, and it's up and down across the different channels. And the sooner I think brands and retailers optimize for that and are really thinking about just serving them how they want to, when they want to, where they want to, I think that's going to be their best foot forward.
Amazing. Yes, I totally agree. And now I'm gonna switch a little bit to sort of your leadership and your skill set. Um, we've really bonded over like strategy because that's where we've sat most of our careers. And in fact, when we did a global survey of retail leaders, we asked about different retail personas, whether you're an experience evangelist or a technology innovator. And one of them was strategy setter. And in fact, that was the most popular persona. About 23% of our leaders identified as that. And I definitely think that you're the archetype of a strategy setter, given your career experience. But so, what does it mean to you to be a strategy setter? What kind of skills or principles that you incorporate in your day-to-day job?
Yeah, strategy is one of those words that, having had it as defining in my career, feels so overused sometimes. But I think one of the most important things in being a strategy setter, or what would define being a strategy setter, is the clarity of an objective. Where are we headed? What's the end game? But also the ability to put it into the context of the environment. The notion of being, I'm going to make it up a little bit, an international brand for the sake of being an international brand, versus starting in the context of, does your brand carry across geographies? Does your product resonate in more countries than your original country? How do you put some of the facts on the table? That's the context to absolutely then, to actually then set an end objective that makes sense in that context. And then you've just got to be thoughtful that context changes. The facts on the table, I call them the tea leaves on the table. You put the tea leaves on the table, you read the tea leaves, but times change, the environment may change. We've all gone through that with COVID in a massive way. So you have to be mindful of, has the context changed? Does my end game still make sense in this new world, in this new set of facts, the new information that I can now put on the table? So I think that's where, for me, that notion of being a strategy setter is putting the context on the table, surfacing the insights, defining the priorities, and then building the narrative.
It's awesome. It is about knowing where you're headed and how to get there, but also being flexible enough to change, because the facts on the ground, or the tea leaves, as you put it, do change. I'm going to switch gears a little bit again. And one of the things that I've admired about you over the time that I've known you is just your emphasis on people and your love for management. And one of our key principles that we're exploring at Becoming Retail, there's 6 of them. One of them is inspiring people. So I want to get your take and your philosophy on how to inspire people, especially during times of great change, which is usually, as we've spoken about, means like some sort of digital transformation.
Yeah, that I would take inspire, and I probably would split it into a macro level perspective and maybe more of a micro. And by that, I really mean inspiring a team or an organization versus inspiring an individual. Mm-hmm. At the team and the organization level, I do think it's, how do you make a group feel a part of something, but also then see that they're a part of a bigger whole at the same time. They have a role, and that role is meaningful. And that comes right back to, what's the strategy? And if your broader team understands your strategy, understands their role in delivering it, I think you've got people with direction. And I think having direction is to some extent inspiration. I mean, I can't claim to be the most profound speaker or, someone who's got the whole world view in a bottle. But I have always felt it important to get everybody on board with, the simple stuff. This is why we exist. This is why it's important. And this is what we're going to get done collectively. Really that notion of together, because that emphasizes the belonging. On an individual level, I think it is similar, but goes obviously a little deeper. I mean, all of those survey results that people have looked at in terms of what inspires people in a job is they feel valued. And for me, getting well grounded in what people's strengths are, and then just leaning into those with folks, and letting them engage in an area they feel good about engaging in, is perhaps one of the most critical on a one-to-one, manager to employee level. It's certainly what works for me, I guess. But
Yeah, I'm the same way.
it's also how I like to work with people who work for me. And I think just bringing the best out of people is really a play to their strengths.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I definitely agree. I've always done my best work when I felt valued, what I knew I was doing and what value it brought. And then, of course, just having that direction. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's 2020 and we can't have a conversation. We've alluded to it a bit about the pandemic. And as a strategy setter, what is where do you think the retail industry comes out in the next 3 to 5 years because of the pandemic? And what should we be doing now to prepare for that future?
I think, and I'm sure it's been said by others as well. I mean, we know that this notion of the explosion of digital, the shift to digital has just accelerated beyond anybody's expectations. I was actually looking at the census data yesterday, believe it or not, on e-commerce relative to overall retail. And in the last quarter, it grew 45% versus roughly 12 to 15 for however many quarters prior to that. So it's real, and consumers have gone there, and that's growth in e-commerce that's never going to return to retail. But I do believe, and I still believe, and I have believed, the consumer will return to retail. And so, back to our omni-channel language and what we were talking about, even with Athleta, that notion of an integrated offense, that notion of the fluid, I guess is the word that's coming to mind, experience for the consumer. I guess seamless is what everybody uses, but that notion of you're serving them where they want to be served, how they want to be served, and when they want to be served. The brainstorm of all of the areas is not complete yet that we can think about integrating from a digital perspective with a physical environment. But that's the push that mentally I'm trying to get to, and I'm trying to get my colleagues to, is, what's the 2030 view? Is it really the what's that movie, the Tom Cruise movie where he walks into the Gap and gets identified by name by his eyes?
Oh, Minority Report.
Yes. Unfortunately, it's kind of scary how close we're getting.
Yes.
But it is that notion of both of them will exist. How, for each individual company, are you going to make sure they coexist to the benefit of the consumer, which ultimately will be to the benefit of your brand?
Yeah, I agree that obviously we've accelerated in digital, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for stores, particularly as this subsides, and it's more about making the whole experience seamless and adjusting as we go through this. So I'm going to end our conversation with our favorite question here at Becoming Retail, which is, if you had one word to use to describe the retail industry, what would that word be?
Yeah, you warned me about this one. I think if I have to pick one, I don't like picking one. If I have to pick one, the word that really captures retail for me is fascinating, largely because it captures a lot of other words in that one word of fascinating. Each of us, I said this in the beginning, we're all consumers. And so the notion of what's right in retail, everybody's perspective matters in that regard. And so all of that rolls into me to say, I've never had a dull moment. It is fascinating.
I totally agree. And it moves really fast. It's never dull. There's always something new going on. I just feel like I never have to work a day in my life because it's just so incredibly stimulating.
Right. Oh, well, that would have been a good one too.
Yeah. I went with dynamic was my word.
Dynamic is on my list as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was incredible to speak with you and share your stories with our wider audience. I'm truly grateful and very appreciative. Thank you so much, Alicia.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.